All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for coming to the webinar. My name is Nico Larco. I'm the director of the Urbanism Next Center here at the University of Oregon, and professor here as well. And we are very excited today to have our second session on mobility hubs, following up on the one that we had in December. So I want to address, first of all, the fact that this is a panel with all white males, and this is not ideal. And it's the first one that Urbanism Next has had, and it's not the norm for what we strive for. I will say that I've tried tremendously hard, talked to 8 different groups around the country, sent a ton of emails, trying to find active pilots, have had fantastic conversations with people around the country, but there's very few places that actually have active pilots. So if people know of other active pilots, please do reach out to me. I'd appreciate that. So I apologize, it's not from a lack of trying. And it's definitely not the norm. Okay, so as an introduction, so mobility hubs have garnered a ton of information, a ton of attention and interest over the last couple of years, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of people planning on doing them, trying to figure out siting, trying to figure out how you set up partners, and there's a lot of claims of what the benefits, far-reaching benefits of mobility hubs, but in practice in the United States, and I'll say for a lot of Europe, there's few actual pilots. And so this is a second webinar on this topic where we're continuing to focus on communities that have actually piloted mobility hubs and garner lessons learned from them. We did the first one in December, had great conversations, lots of interest, and we're really thankful for that. We were looking at Minneapolis and Boston's program. And today we're going to be looking at Pittsburgh and Columbus. So we're really looking forward to the conversation here. Let me just briefly introduce the speakers that we have. Tosh Chambers, who's a senior program director at Move PGH. He coordinates a consortium of transportation service providers and mobility as a service offerings in the city of Pittsburgh. And before this, he was actually working for the city of Pittsburgh in the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure as emerging mobility policy analyst. From Columbus, we have Andrew Wolpert, who's the deputy program manager for Smart Columbus. He's had over 20 years of engineering experience from design build to ITS type projects, and has done a ton of work with Smart Columbus. And then we have Jeff Kupko, who's a senior associate from Michael Baker International, 17 years of experience in the field, and is an assistant program manager for emerging tech practice and leads smart communities and vehicle electrification initiatives at Michael Baker International. So we are thrilled to have you all here. Really appreciate that. And with that, the way we're going to structure this, we're going to have each. Tosh is going to do a 20-minute presentation. Then we're going to have Columbus do a 20-minute presentation. Then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. Feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box. I think everyone knows how to use Zoom right now, but if it's either under more or just says Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will be answering these as we go. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tosh and turn off my video.
Thank you so much, Nico, and so glad to be here today, and so glad to talk about mobility hubs. I think a really exciting topic. I will share my screen. I think someone else needs to discontinue. Okay. And I think Nico did a good job at introducing me and providing some of my background. I'm the senior program director for Move PGH here in Pittsburgh. And I should say, actually, although I'm kind of the spokesperson for this program, there has been a lot of different folks involved in this project, namely Karina Ricks, the former director of the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure in Pittsburgh. This is kind of her brainchild, and Kim Lucas, the acting director of DOMI, continues to kind of work in this very actively. So this is a product of many minds that I want to give a shout out to. So I'd like to introduce this program that we've run, and Mobility Hubs is certainly a part of it. But as I mentioned, this is a kind of program spinoff of the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, also known as DOMI, affectionately. And this kind of started in 2019, where we were looking for a coalition of shared mobility services that we could kind of coordinate together as one kind of cohesive unit in Pittsburgh. So thusly, Pittsburgh Mobility Collective was formed, which we kind of combined some of the existing transportation entities, such as our bike share, our transit authority, with some of the new providers that we selected via an RFP process. So I'll kind of take you through some of the members of the PMC in the next slide. But after a little bit of preparation, some false starts due to COVID, we were able to launch our program in July of 2021, and ultimately started providing Pittsburghers with more access to different types of transportation, and kind of increased information and tools to access shared transportation. So some of the key goals are behind this project are to coordinate these transportation options both digitally and physically. So on the digital component side, we've been working with a transit app, which not only shows information on transit, the routes, and real arrival times. It can also do trip planning. There are now other modes involved in this app, not only just information, but now we're getting to this realm where we can facilitate booking of transit and other modes. Excuse me. This spring, we'll be rolling out some of that feature for some of the other providers in Pittsburgh. And then physically, we want to co-locate and coordinate our shared mobility options using mobility hubs, what we're here to talk about today, to support that multimodality and kind of ease of transfers. I should mention this is a program that has not been funded by any taxpayer dollars. It's really just grant funded, a total of around 300,000, and that goes to funding staff such as myself and some other pilots, actually not really related to the mobility hubs. So this is kind of a shoestring budget, I think, for introducing a program such as this. So this is the look at the various partners of the Pittsburgh Mobility Collective. As you can see, DOMI is kind of the overseer, setting the rules and priorities. I'm with Innovate PGH and kind of staffing the management of this collaboration, being the liaison between DOMI and these providers. And of course, we've had support from a number of other nonprofit providers or partners, excuse me. And as you can see here, the options available within the city of Pittsburgh. These were some of the existing ones, but we've since welcomed Spin, Zipcar, which already had a presence in Pittsburgh, but we've also introduced Waze Carpool, and Scooby is actually a legacy Pittsburgh provider as well. I mentioned the transit app supporting the digital component, but I also wanted to underline SwiftMile being a kind of key partner, especially regarding the mobility hubs here. And you may notice that we only really have one company for each type of mode. That is pretty unique to the partnership here, and I can discuss that a little bit later on. So yes, mobility hubs were kind of a very early on kind of idea and desire as a part of this initiative. It was mentioned in DOMI's RFP when it was released, and Spin, who responded as kind of the leader of the PMC, really took that and offered 50 mobility hubs to be installed throughout the city as part of Move PGH. So, where do we go from there? And what is actually a mobility hub? So we had to have a lot of these discussions very early on, and we did so at our first physical meeting. This was back in 2019 when this was easier to do, but we had a lot of kind of ideations on what exactly are we trying to achieve. Of course, we couldn't do that all in one day, so then we, as the PMC, formed a working group with various stakeholders representing all of the different services to help answer some of these key questions around what actually is a mobility hub. I won't go through all of these word by word, but these were some of the kind of answers that we came to in regarding some of these questions. I should note, what actually constitutes a hub. We kind of decided to define that as including 3 or more transportation nodes co-located as a cohesive place. So that could include, a bus stop. It could include maybe a bike share station or other kind of docking station for micromobility. And we also elected to classify information such as real-time transit updates or wayfinding, mode finding could be one of those elements that we count as well. We made some decisions on where the hubs should generally be placed, what kind of priorities we were looking for there, and also decided that we definitely wanted to involve the communities in actually deciding where mobility hubs go. But we also found that there's a lot of very technical components that require us as the deciders, as DOMI, to take that decision-making process as far as we could, and then hand it over to the communities for a kind of consultation to find a final spot. So after coming to all those decisions on what a mobility hub actually is, and getting a graphic artist to do a great impression of what a mobility hub should ideally look like, this is what we were kind of striving for. We wanted something vibrant and joyful, providing many amenities and transportation options, somewhere for people to convene, and is very kind of central and convenient for their typical commute. And everybody is enjoying themselves, loving mobility here. This is really what we want to see. Of course, that vision kind of butts up against what reality actually is. And I want to mention some of the maybe constraints that we had in kind of achieving that vision. So budget, of course, is maybe number one, where we didn't really have a fund to pull from to create that vision. So that was definitely kind of a barrier. Of course, COVID-19 was a bit of an aspect, prevented us from doing a lot of the in-person engagement that we had hoped to do, something that would be ideal for mobility hubs. We were finding some constraints in how partners can deploy some of their services, so that was a factor. Space conflicts, of course, and infrastructure all factored into what we can actually achieve in mobility hubs. So what that actually means is we take a little bit of a piecemeal approach. I'll show what that actually kind of looks like, but because of the budget constraints, we're kind of planning these piece by piece rather than having everything in mind at the beginning and implementing. Of course, we were limited in the in-person engagement. We were finding that certain locations just don't work as far as available infrastructure and space. And not every case we were able to achieve all of the modes present at mobility hubs like we may have liked. So then what actually are mobility hubs? How do you get started? So like I said, Spin committed these Swift Mile stations, these kind of micromobility charging stations as a component of their offering in Move PGH. So that's where we kind of elected to start. As you can see, this is kind of the equipment to right here. This is equipment that is actually manufactured and was purchased from the company Swift Mile, purchased by Spin. So all of these elements are owned by Spin and have been kind of installed in public space and are permitted by the city of Pittsburgh. This is because Spin wanted to test a kind of hub-based system for their dockless scooters. Of course, the charging component helps to ease some of their operations, helps to organize the parking, which is typically kind of an issue for cities historically. And then there's also this digital screen component, which allows not only for things like advertising, but also information, PSAs can be displayed on here, and that's been a great part of this relationship. So Spin committed to installing 50 of these over the 2 years. That's something we've been able to achieve kind of gradually installing these in in public spaces over time, kind of going through various neighborhoods and accomplishing that kind of gradually. I mentioned that scooter users can park and plug in. They're actually incentivized to do so. They get a $1 discount. So we kind of wanted to test how effective that might be. I mentioned the advertising and public information. We've coordinated in releasing PSAs and also advertising of some of Spin's kind of equity programs and other valuable information for scooter riding. Some of these stations, I don't think the screen components can work this way, but there are iterations that just have a solar panel or batteries that can run without kind of connecting to the electrical grid. That doesn't work in Pittsburgh. It may work in Southern California or Arizona, where you have plenty of sun, but it's pretty cloudy, including right now. So we were kind of forced to connect these to the electrical grid. Of course, these can be kind of branded and signed in any unique way that you'd prefer. But the advertising is kind of key, as it kind of brings in some revenue to help finance the stations ultimately, and thus creating like a more sustainable business model for Spin in Pittsburgh. So briefly, I wanted to show some of the specs in case you're curious. This is not a very large piece of infrastructure, just around like 13 feet long, so kind of less than a typical parking space. And these are pretty durable pieces of equipment that and also rely on transit screen for the real-time transit arrival information. This actually isn't a display of that, but I'll show that a little bit later. And we also striped these and put up deflector poles, put up those flex posts to kind of make it a safe area when in the street. So I think what is kind of unique to our approach here is that we decided to install these without doing any actual trenching, or really wanted to pilot that as a possibility, as it would really decrease the project costs significantly. As far as I know, like the equipment, I think it costs around $15,000, and just ripping up the concrete and connecting electrical conduit, that would cost roughly 2 to 3 times just the equipment cost. So instead, we wanted to test kind of connecting these directly to city-powered streetlights. And that was kind of difficult figuring out exactly how that would work in terms of Spin and how they connect and how they pay for that electricity in a fair way. So the street lights here in Pittsburgh are paid for via tariff, meaning they're not really metered. We're not really sure exactly how much energy is spent at each one, but it's paid for kind of generally, where we assume the energy usage at each one, and it's kind of an equation of paying that bill over a year's time based on just what we know of usage at streetlights. So Spin was able to kind of estimate the total use of power using SwiftMile's internal metrology, which is not a kind of utility approved way of metering, but our utility company here was willing to kind of pilot this this program that allowed them to kind of estimate the power usage, but then we did install a few stations that had actual utility grade meters for us to understand how that metrology was lining up with actual usage. And Spin worked with a city light contractor, Allegheny City Electric, which actually handles all of our streetlight installations, to complete all of this work, so that all of that knowledge on how to install was kind of kept inside that contractor who knows this realm very well. So now you get to actually see what that looks like. And yeah, it essentially kind of looks like a little extension cord run. In this case, it kind of is snaked underneath the lip here, and hooked up to the electrical components inside the street light here. This is not a huge electrical draw, so it really isn't too difficult to do this in every case, but there were assessments to know that we weren't exceeding the capacity of these street light lines. In some cases, when we were installing in the street, there would be a little bit longer conduit. We didn't have a limit on exactly how long it could be, but required that there would have to be kind of ADA compliant ramps covering these cords, not causing any issues in terms of or kind of barriers to movement. In some cases, we decided to move around some street furniture, some planters to kind of discourage anyone from trying to go in between the pole and these stations, just as kind of this extra safety measure. And the power had to connect to this component of the hub. So in some cases, we had to be a little creative in routing the conduit next to the curb. Not going underground at all and preventing us from spending a little bit extra, but that's how it had to be done.
Tosh, we've got like about 1 or 2 more minutes, just so to.
Okay. So I'll go through here pretty quickly. We, of course, wanted to spread these out throughout the city. We did a lot of analysis, kind of looking at our equity factors and divvying up where these hubs had to be. So some had to be in these kind of equity designated areas, some in transit access zones, and how it was kind of conducted. DOMI would actually identify the viable sites within corridors in neighborhoods, and then we would be able to hand that off to the community to vote on the actual final location. Just some requirements in what we had to consider. There's a lot to consider, as you can see, but really the main considerations were access to power, zoning, and we wanted these to connect to transit lines to help serve as that kind of first and last mile connection. As I said, we kind of identified these optimal sites based on the available infrastructure, the streetlights really, and then we were connected to community groups. They would kind of decide what the right path for engagement with the community would be. And we relied on an online engagement platform to kind of determine the location there. And then, as you can see, we were kind of limited really by that equipment and the zoning and electrical components to find where mobility hubs would be. So then where do the other components come in? Well, thankfully, Zipcar spaces, unelectrified bike share stations, they're a little bit more flexible in where you can place them. So like I said, it's kind of piecemeal, adding those elements in when we can get those commitments from our partners to then eventually create more mobility hub around more like that dream that I spoke of. And then, like I said, we don't have a ton of funding to introduce other elements, but we are planning to include wayfinding / mode finding at these mobility hubs, installing those this summer and unlocking other funding, hopefully very soon, to introduce other nice amenities and elements. These final takeaways I could speak about for a little while, but these are, I think, some key suggestions that I may have for cities looking to do the same thing. I think these stations opened up a lot of possibility and as far as communicating information with the screens and organizing the micromobility system. But it does require some funding. It requires a lot of time and resources, staff resources, just to organize the placement and engagement around them and they're kind of consistent maintenance as well. But I'll save it at that and I guess wait for questions after the second presentation. But thank you for your time.
Great, thank you. That was great. That was great, and we will definitely got a whole lot of questions to follow up with. And there's also a couple questions in the Q&A already and in the chat. So you can answer if you ask. If for those of you who are listening, if you ask questions in the Q&A, we can type answers as we go as well. So feel free to do that, Tosh. And I will pass it over then to Andy and Jeff.
All right, thanks, Nico. Share my screen. All right. Well, thank you for allowing us to be a part of this discussion. They really appreciate it. Andy Wolpert with City of Columbus. I was the Deputy Program Manager for the Smart Columbus program. And we'll discuss our Mobility Hubs project today. Jeff will add in here. Jeff was our consultant program manager, or project manager for our Smart Mobility Hubs project, along with other projects. Just a little bit of background. So as many of you know, USDOT had a Smart City Challenge. This was back in 2016, where over 78 cities had applied. And the City of Columbus was a winner of the grant, and we won $40 million from USDOT. In addition, we won $10 million from the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation, too, which focused on electrification as part of our Smart Columbus portfolio. The program, we had our vision and mission and outcomes. These are very similar to any other vision, mission and outcomes that other cities have, facing challenges and trying to improve the transportation system and seeing how technology and ITS can be a part of that. So our portfolio of projects, we had many projects. We had connected vehicles. So we had a corridor with 3 of our main arterial systems with over 88 roadside units. And we had about 1,200 vehicles with onboard units. We enhanced our Park Columbus mobile app to give us prediction of the probability of being able to get parking spots, being able to reserve spots in garages, lots. We had our autonomous vehicles, which was part of our mobility as a service system. We had one of our autonomous vehicles running between mobility hubs. That was our Linden Leap project with our Easy Mile shuttle. And then our multimodal trip planner, that was also part of our mobility as a service vision for City of Columbus, where we developed a multimodal trip planning app where it aggregated various modes, transit, scooters, ride hailing, TNCs, carpooling, bike share, all into one app, and would combine modes based upon your preferences to get your destination. Those are open source using Open Trip Planner. Of course, our smart mobility hubs we'll talk about, and then the electrification from the Paul G. Allen side of things, introducing charging infrastructure, electrifying our fleet, and then electric vehicle adoption for the general public. So we're going to dive into our smart mobility hubs conversation. And so it was nice to hear from Tosh and some of the problems, challenges that Pittsburgh had, because we have the same type of challenges here in the City of Columbus. And the system that we had was, very siloed, where we had our transit system operating independently. They had park and ride systems. They introduced Wi-Fi into their buses. We did have our bus rapid transit line introduced in 2017, 2018. Then we had various mobility providers, scooters being one of them, just kind of dropped into Columbus one afternoon back in 2018 that we had to begin to accommodate for, and along with other mobility providers. But we wanted all these modes to act as one in one system. And that's where the mobility hubs and our multicultural planner really acted in concert together. One of the keys was stakeholder engagement, which happened early and often at the beginning of the Smart Columbus program. This is a picture from our Linden, one of our Linden community workshops. Our Linden community is one of the opportunity neighborhoods in the city of Columbus, has been disadvantaged, has many transportation challenges. So we really wanted to solve this neighborhood's problems as best we could as part of the Smart Columbus program using technology. We engaged with community leaders in Linden. We had Linden liaisons, which were part of the Smart Columbus team, you could say. They were residents in Linden that were actually paid through our public engagement firm to go to events, go door to door, go to areas within the community, talk, get feedback, and bring that back to us. That was one of the things that we really found, that people in the community were really comfortable talking to those that lived and experienced the community. And so that helped us in getting information back too. We talked to transit, Central Ohio Transit Authority here, and all the mobility providers. And through that, we identified places of interest, community resources that we wanted to talk to as part of these mobility hubs, that engaging through the community they identified for us. Our geographic focus was the Linden neighborhood, and you can see the areas that were of greatest interest to us. And we had a total of 6 hubs as part of this program. Jeff will dive into what the attributes were, the design process for these hubs. But the Linden area, we had the CMAX line, our bus rapid transit, running right along Cleveland Avenue. So we wanted to improve connection to public transit as part of our mobility hubs, really solving that first mile, last mile challenge that people would express to us. Also, people can get to a better connection to jobs, goods, and services. And we had the Easton Transit Center as a mobility hub, which was to the northeast of the Linden area. But Easton is a large commercial residential development area within the city of Columbus. And there's a lot of jobs in Easton, so people from Linden getting to jobs, and then just getting other services and shopping and so forth. So that was why we wanted to have one there too, to help people get from the bus system into the proper, the Easton proper area. All right, and I'm going to hand it off to Jeff to dive into the hub discussion.
Great, thanks, Andy. So yeah, as we were refining the mode options that we would have at each of the sites, it required both engagement with our stakeholders for each site to determine if there were any modes that they did or didn't want on the site, and also just needed us to evaluate the context of the areas. So for instance, we also had to be agile in our deployments, because our criteria for bike sharing was to set it within a mile of an existing station. And while we were in process, the developer in Easton actually ended up deploying their own set of stations and bikes, and that unlocked our ability to provide one at the Easton Transit Center. So the context at each of the sites we knew wasn't going to be completely consistent as far as available modes, but we wanted to make sure we fit within the site parameters of what each stakeholder would want. So as we go into next slide, we'll show you some of our partners that we had. And so you can see on the left, the property stakeholders, CODA, St. Stephen's Community House, which was the community anchor, providing many services, the library, and also Columbus State Community College. Our kiosks that we leveraged were actually a kind of add-on based on a deployment within the city. As we were, again, being agile throughout the process, we were writing requirements and defining what we wanted the kiosks to do within the confines of the mobility hubs. And the city had entered into an agreement with Experience Columbus, who contracted with Ike Smart City to deploy the interactive kiosks through many areas of the cities. And Ike Smart City is managed by Orange Barrel Media, who's also a Columbus company. So it made sense for us to build off of that contract because it gave us the opportunity to be seen as a consistent experience. We didn't want like one area of the city to be seen as having a different type of technology than other areas. And it also provides a consistent experience as well. On the mobility provider side, Kogo, our bike share, which is owned and managed by Lyft. We had Yellow Cab being our ride share provider. Lime and Spin you see on there, as well as Easy Miles. Andy kind of mentioned that it was connecting two of our mobility hubs, the St. Stephen's and the Linden Transit Center, providing access into the community from there. Highlighting some of the pictures and the features of what we included. We wanted to provide that dedicated dockless parking area on the sites. So in hearing our site stakeholders that they wanted to have some sort of organization with dockless devices. Andy certainly talked about that, scooters showed up on one day. We as a city at least were recognizing the fact that they were a valuable asset to mobility in the community. And so we worked with them to set parameters rather than prohibiting their use until an agreement was made. But then we also worked with them on this aspect of where they could stage bikes and also restrict where people park the bike or the scooters on our sites. The bottom left, you can see one of our Kogo stations. And in the middle is one of the Ike Smart City kiosks. It actually shows the CODA map. This was one of the enhancements that we had, that we worked with Ike Smart City to have put into the kiosk. So anybody can bring up transit maps on the screen and find where they need to go. We also wanted to find a way to provide consistent and easily identifiable signage at each of the sites so somebody could determine what modes were available. You can see the mock-up on the right there of the different modes or aspects that would be available at a specific mobility hub. And that way, for quick reference, somebody could determine what would be available there. So just, showcasing here a little bit more, we primarily were supporting the Linden area residents, and so wanted to showcase St. Stephen's Community House there. You can see that we have some spin scooters parked in our dockless parking area. We do have the bike share as well. There is a traditional bike rack just off to the right of this picture. And then in this vicinity as well is where we have the AV shuttle to drop off passengers right by the front door for access. And on the right, this is at the Linden Library. So the Linden Library was kind of a split site based on the sides. We had the bikes and we had the kiosk on this side. Closer to the door on the other side of the building, we had our dockless parking area and our ride-hailing pickup and drop-off area. You can also see we did a demonstration this is one of the sites where we did some docked scooter parking as well, and the ability to provide charging to those scooters. So similar to what was done in Pittsburgh, but this docking was developed by Ike Smart City as part of a demonstration program within the city. Again, kind of aligning with that, being agile through the process and how we can support mobility. All right, so hitting some of the high level aspects of this, overall, the project was $1.3 million. Now, we're certainly recognizing that a lot of that because of our duties and responsibilities to the US DOT as part of the Smart City Challenge, there was a lot of engineering and program management associated with that. You can see the construction and installation actually is a pretty minimal amount of money. And so in our mind, trying to scale these across the city, it's a very affordable way of trying to transition modes and support first and last mile connections. We did experience delays due to COVID. We were originally targeting to launch anywhere from February to April of 2020. We ultimately launched at the end of July of 2020 once we saw some type of travel patterns start to return, and we concluded our performance measurement in March of 2021. Certainly the hubs are still out there, but for our demonstration purposes, we concluded data collection. Over 1,000 bike share trips to and from the hub locations, and we had over 65,000 kiosk interactions. So there certainly was some movement within the sites and some usability. We also were able to install EV charging through partnership between us, CODA, and our local electric provider, AEP. And that was at the Northern Lights Shopping Center Park and Ride, where there were 6 EV charging plugs installed. And that would facilitate mode transfer onto our bus rapid transit line. It also installed those charging stations in an opportunity neighborhood as well to have some equity component to future mobility of EV charging. So our outcomes, we installed 4 new bike share stations. We're providing Wi-Fi out of the kiosks. So for those with limited data plans, we can provide better access to the internet. On the customer satisfaction side, we certainly recognize there was a low usage. We largely impacted by COVID and the time frame that we were able to measure the performance. We expect that might continue to grow as travel fully returns. Do have the hit there from Chet, who's our Kogo Bike Share Operations Manager, and saying, it really integrates that first last mile connection into the Linden community, which was our goal. So it's great to see others recognizing that fact. I do want to showcase one of our graphics created. Now, we had all of our data go back to the Smart Columbus operating system. And so we were able to analyze various types of data from the kiosk to certainly the bike share here. And you can see where we had some of our highest usage. Cleveland Avenue and Mount Vernon on the far right is Columbus State Community College. That was an existing bike share station, and it had pretty good usage going to the community college. I think that one of the nicest things that we saw throughout the pandemic was the usage at the library location. And that was where people were able to still continue access to technology and learning materials when, schooling and working from home. So I think we were able to support the library and mobility to and from the library greatly. And then, as I previously mentioned about Eastern Transit Center, we had some pretty good usage there as well. As well as some of our highest e-bike usage, which was a new mode that was introduced as well, or new aspect of the mode during our project, that e-bikes were introduced into the bike share fleet, and Easton was an opportune area for that due to some of the longer distances you would travel. And so we saw great usage there. So on to our lessons learned. Certainly our stakeholder engagement drove that early alignment of our goals and the location. So it set the stage for our partners to work with us and then work with the mobility providers. So we worked with each entity to develop mobility provider agreements. So the city and the site stakeholders had our own agreements, and then we entered into them as well with the mobility providers so that we could ensure that they were participating in the project and giving us the necessary data that we needed for performance measurement. That was obviously a big discussion around data, but most of our partners saw where we needed to report out as part of our overall program and aligned accordingly. Leveraging those partner contributions with the kiosk, it really helped create a holistic solution that can be scaled across the city. So there's plenty of other kiosk locations around the city that we could also now evaluate to see if they should become mobility hubs, and they could be enhanced with some of those dockless parking areas or bike share stations, and we could start to create more and more hubs around the cities. And it also helped us reduce project costs by not having to go out and procure kiosks, where we were able to just leverage what was already in the city. And our communications after we were complete, certainly engaging with the community and our other partners to let everyone know that they were out there to build the awareness. So on to the next slide. Just kind of as a note of looking forward of the sustainabilities, the Department of Public Service takes ownership in that growth, and certainly where the hubs are in public right away, the city is continuing to own and maintain, and where they were on the private property, our stakeholders are continuing. And we have an initiative called Linked Us in the City, where we're looking at expanding mobility corridors, and kiosks have made it in, mobility hubs have made it into the planning decisions and become ingrained in as part of the city's planning efforts moving forward.
All right, thanks. Let's quickly moving forward. What we have going, we talked about solving our community challenges and how ITS can do that. And what we learned is, yes, technology can benefit all of our communities here in Columbus, particularly our underserved.
Well, I think we just lost Andy.
We did lose Andy. I don't know what happened there.
Well, hopefully he will come back. Maybe is there anything else you wanted to add, Jeff? And if not, maybe we'll just go straight to Q&A.
I was going to see if I could go ahead and step in and share because I also have the presentation. But I think maybe we can just go to some Q&A and see if
Andy comes back.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so thank you. That was a great presentation and so interesting to see both the programs and some of the similarities and some of the differences. And the first thing, I'll also mention for those of you who haven't taken a look at the Q&A, Tosh has been on a mad tear of answering questions. So there's a ton of typed out answers over there. So one of the questions I have is they're really different models in terms of, Move PGH has one of each mode and you started out partnering with those, right? In other words, like you kind of created the whole thing together. One and kind of said you will be our bike provider, you will be our scooter provider. Columbus had a different approach, right? So that we're creating a platform anyone wants to plug in. I wonder if you could each talk about some of the benefits and challenges of taking each one of those approaches. Maybe Tosh, you can start.
Sure. Yeah. So this was kind of a core tenet of the program from the start. And the intent was to really kind of protect the providers, allowing them to hopefully kind of have dominion, I guess, of their mode type to just really make it more sustainable, economically feasible for them to operate. Because we're seeing a lot of other experiences, especially like dockless micromobility. I do think that's been really a valuable experience, especially with our scooter provider, because we know they work very responsibly, work very closely with the city, and the programs they offer are kind of top notch. And I do think that's been beneficial. I'd say on the flip side, in maybe some of the other modes, that kind of gets to be a little frustrating, where we have maybe a couple car share companies interested to get into Pittsburgh, that we kind of have to hold off into introducing them because we're kind of working with our designated partner. And really we want just more service for everybody, so that can be kind of frustrating, but we do kind of use that as leverage to push our current partners a little bit further. Yeah.
And can I just ask, how did you set this up? In other words, did you say, we're doing this and you are our provider, forever and ever, amen? Or was it like and this is a 2-year commitment and then we will like recompete or open it up, or, anyone can come in? How did you set that up?
Yeah, so it was kind of a lengthy process. For the scooters especially, they actually had to be authorized by state legislation to be operated in Pennsylvania because they were not street legal vehicles at the time. So that led us to set it up in this way that it would be a pilot where we just have one provider. And that also required legislation at the local code level to essentially say that the director of the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure has the authority to only permit up to a certain amount of micromobility vehicles. We didn't say that we are limiting the number of providers coming in, but we set that cap of vehicles at the same level as what's kind of encoded. So really it empowers the director to make that choice of selectively permitting the micromobility companies.
Great, thank you. So Jeff, can you talk about the approach you all took, which was really quite different? And maybe also talk a little bit about the public-private partnership, which is kind of inherent in this.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the private partnership was certainly one of those key aspects of our program. I mean, in recognizing that we, as part of the Smart City Challenge and the grant itself, was leveraging those private investments to support it. You know, we didn't maybe know all of those private entities we'd be engaging with at the time of the application. But I think those are really what helped us move through a lot of the barriers, is having a lot of that support from private mobility providers, some of our public and private site stakeholders, in addition to the city. It really was that building a consensus of what mobility means and what it could do for the community that helped move the initiative along, rather than just a one-off approach. It was a lot of people getting together and recognizing how we can enhance mobility, particularly in some of our more affected neighborhoods.
And well, following up a little bit on the kind of approach that Pittsburgh took, did you feel like ever that there was benefit to saying, well, you know, we've got 3 different providers for this thing, and so like you all can show me, like, shine as bright as you possibly can? Or was there times that you thought, you know, I'm not getting the engagement because there's not a limited market? I mean, it's really interesting. You know, some scooter companies have said that they won't go into markets that aren't limited.
Yeah, certainly. And, you know, as we were writing our lessons learned, you know, we actually had a discussion, and it was coincidentally just before Pittsburgh made its announcement on deploying as like an all-in-one system. And we thought that could be one of those solutions to help mitigate some of the challenges that we had seen in trying to bring together all of the mobility providers and provide the data that we required, and just making sure that they're fully participating. You know, some mobility providers did not participate. Ride-sharing companies particularly were more of a challenge. So, you know, we thought that, hey, that might be one way moving forward that this could be mitigated. The other side of that coin could be limited choices, where maybe you only have one scooter company at all of your, you know, mobility hubs, or do you have different mobility hubs for different types of providers? I mean, those are all considerations looking forward. But those are things, as opposed to having like 1 or 2 people try to constantly engage mobility providers to sign the agreements and agree to the terms and get devices out there. It could help with just one unified contract.
Yeah, that's totally interesting, right? This like kind of limited companies would give the city a little bit more leverage and a little bit more engagement from the cities. But then how do you long term make sure that you're not then limiting options for everyone because you've created this monopoly? A lot of questions came up in the chat and from the Q&A on what utilization has been like. So you showed, Jeff, you showed some of the numbers from that. So a couple questions. How does it compare to non-hub areas, that kind of utilization? Are you seeing any income, gender, or race kind of issues in terms of differentiating demographics? Is the private sector excited about this? Are they saying like, you know, oh, this is really helps us with our business model? Are you seeing any first-time riders? A whole slew of questions around who's riding.
Yeah, sure. I will say we don't really have data from non-hub areas, you know, as that largely comes from then the mobility providers themselves are keeping a lot of that data. I mean, from our bike share, we can access it. It's publicly accessible data set, but from some of the other entities, it's more of a challenge to compare. We do have some type of demographic data and more granular trip data for those trips that are booked through our multimodal trip planning application. So we can make that a data set available through the shared streets methodology, and that way we're not infringing on anybody, but we are able to get a little more granular in some of that data. I think what we've seen in the mobility providers perspective is that this kind of shows the city making its own investment. And when I say that is most cities, and Columbus did in particular, is when they allowed scooters, for instance, to be able to deploy, they required X percentage to be deployed into the lower income opportunity neighborhoods. And so by the city focusing on putting mobility hubs and mode transfer, it showed that kind of counter investment to say, not only are we saying you have to deploy them in these areas, we're also supporting the movement of people in these areas. So it's not just a checking the box type of effort.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tosh, what kind of things are you all seeing in utilization? Who's using it, and what kind of impacts it's having?
Yeah, so we have seen, we've been able to conduct a survey. We've seen kind of the general data trends of the scooters. It has been really encouraging, I'll say, to see not only kind of anecdotally, but in what we've seen in the survey, these have been used by minorities, not just Black people, but also Latino and Asian populations as well. We see a pretty wide span of age usage as well, but definitely, especially in that kind of 18 to 34 demographic. Definitely see a lot of usage around our business districts and our universities. I'd say like maybe about a third of the usage is either to or from our largest universities here, Pitt and CMU. That is still a success and helpful. We actually, the neighborhoods kind of in those student-oriented areas actually don't have very good transit connections, and you would have to walk about a mile and a half to get to campus. So that's kind of like that prime use case for the scooters. So it's encouraging to see that usage, but also citywide, we've just seen a lot of usage of the scooters, and we're also tracking how that may impact our bike share, our transit system, and there's still plenty of data to assess. We haven't been here for a year yet, but it's been encouraging. It doesn't seem that there's too much like cannibalization of the transit modes that we want to preserve through this project.
That's
yeah,
great.
and I think even where Tosh was kind of hitting on that, it would have been great to have some more data. And I think having that all in one model gives that more visibility onto how all of the modes are used, where we have some data on some of the modes or more granular on some of the modes just based on the providers that we're engaging with.
That's great. That's great. All right, I'm gonna shoehorn in one last question, which is going to be really simple, so you guys can answer so quickly. But glad to see that Andy was able to join again.
Yeah,
no worries. So, what do you see as the biggest barriers of continued growth of mobility hubs? And I'm going to add a second question: is like, should they grow? In other words, these are a lot of efforts to make this. You're in the early, like figuring out how it's working. Do you see this as like, these are actually, yes, the promise of these things, even though they might not, you're starting out, so you're early on, but do you see like big promise of these things? And then what do you see as barriers to getting there? Maybe we'll start with Andy, since he just came in.
No, thanks. Yes, sorry about that. My computer restarted. I think that definitely there's great opportunity. I see it definitely along our Linkus corridor, where we want to try to redevelop some of our mobility corridors from a zoning perspective, land use perspective, and mobility perspective. So yes, I really do think there's an opportunity there too. And then some barriers is getting mobility providers involved. If particularly if a city doesn't have any type of permitting over that mobility provider. Because we've heard from other mobility providers at the national level that they want to create their own type of system and their own type of hubs, and maybe it doesn't necessarily fall within what we want. So those are some challenges.
That's great. That's a great list. Tosh?
Yeah, I do definitely think that mobility hubs are valuable. I think they just kind of daylight shared transportation and show kind of a heightened level of maybe convenience depending on transit and other shared modes in combination. I think, yeah, one of the biggest things to figure out about mobility hubs is electrification, especially as we're having more e-bikes come in, electric vehicle charging being more of a component that cities are focusing on. That I think all needs to be coordinated as one kind of hub for e-vehicle charging to kind of combine costs. But you have to get all of those different interests and stakeholders to play nicely and kind of agree, this is what we're doing, this is where we're doing it. So it's a bit of a challenge, but it's exciting.
That's great. Those are great answers. Jeff, anything you'd add to that?
I'll just build a tiny little bit on what Tosh said in the interest of time. I mean, just agreeing not only on like electrical standards. I mean, do you have different, speeds of electric you need, or you know what I mean? Are you looking at 120 or 480 in the street or something like that, and how they play nicely together there, and agreeing on standards around data as well. And I think that's always an important component, just measuring your success and then determining how you could scale. Data is important, but it's also a touchy subject at times. So
that is great. With that, I think we are probably at time here. Thank you all for taking the time. Thanks to everyone for joining. Really appreciate the conversation. Tons of questions that thankfully got answered. I really appreciate everyone typing in furiously over there. This will be available online. We'll put the full presentation, and I will ask all of you if we can share your presentations themselves, and we'll be able to post them there if you're okay with that. And thank you so much. Looking forward to the next conversation.